The flashbulbs erupted, blinding streaks of white against the opulent black and gold of the Fairmont Grand Ballroom. Isabella Thorne, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, clutched the heavy velvet curtain, a phantom pain twisting in her belly. Just beyond the shimmering barrier, a wave of applause swelled, echoing the exact moment her world shattered. Her husband, Richard Thorne, stood bathed in the spotlight, his arm wrapped possessively around a woman who was decidedly not his wife. It was Serena Vance, the rising starlet whose face graced billboards and magazine covers, now glowing beside her husband. Richard's smile, usually reserved and almost austere in public, was wide and unrestrained, a vibrant beacon of betrayal. Isabella, 6 months pregnant, and reeling from his casual announcement just last week that he needed space, felt the bitter bile rise in her throat. He hadn't just taken space. He had filled it with someone else, publicly, flagrantly. The roar of the crowd, the tinkling of champagne glasses, the saccharine music. It all blended into a deafening symphony of her humiliation. Isabella had spent the day in a haze, the doctor's appointment confirming her suspicions, the persistent nausea, the unusual cravings, the fluttering life within her. A baby. Richard's baby. She'd clutched the sonogram photo, a tiny, blurry promise, feeling a fragile hope bloom amidst the recent chill in their marriage. She had planned a romantic dinner, a quiet revelation, hoping the news would bridge the growing chasm between them. Instead, she'd walked into their sprawling suburban mansion, the scent of his expensive cologne lingering in the air, only to find a hastily scribbled note on the marble kitchen island. "Isabella, I need some time alone. Don't worry, I'll be in touch." No explanation, no further details, just a cold, impersonal dismissal after 12 years of marriage. He hadn't even called. Hours later, scrolling through her phone, a society gossip site had caught her eye. Richard Thorne, tech mogul, steps out with actress Serena Vance at pre-Gala event. The accompanying photo showed them laughing, Serena's hand delicately placed on his arm, her eyes sparkling with an intimacy Isabella hadn't seen in Richard for months. The space he needed wasn't solitude. It was a stage. Tonight was the annual Thorne Foundation Charity Gala, an event Isabella had meticulously planned for months, an event she was supposed to co-host. He hadn't even bothered to tell her he wouldn't be attending with her. He simply replaced her, driven by a desperate, agonizing need to understand, to witness the depth of his cruelty. Isabella had chosen an inconspicuous, flowing black gown, one that artfully concealed her burgeoning bump, and slipped into the gala like a ghost. She'd arranged for a private car, entering through a service entrance, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses and a silk scarf, a desperate anonymity clinging to her. Now, from her vantage point in a dimly lit alcove near the main ballroom entrance, the reality was a brutal, physical blow. Richard, usually so composed, so careful with his public image, was practically preening. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, his silver hair catching the light, making him look distinguished, powerful. Serena in a shimmering emerald green gown that accentuated her slender figure, hung on his every word, her laughter a melodic counterpoint to the drone of the gala. Isabella felt a primal scream build in her chest, but it was trapped, suffocating, a silent testament to her shock. She watched as a procession of society columnists and photographers descended upon them. Richard, usually media-shy, posed readily, his arm still around Serena's waist. He even leaned in, whispering something in her ear that made her throw her head back and laugh, a dazzling, unburdened sound. Isabella's vision blurred. Was this the man she had loved, built a life with, shared dreams with? This polished stranger, so openly flaunting his infidelity. A waiter, oblivious to the drama unfolding, offered her a tray of champagne. She shook her head, a quiet no, her hand instinctively going to her stomach, protecting the secret life within. The baby. Her baby. How could Richard do this? How could he discard her, their years, their future, with such callous disregard? The weight of her pregnancy suddenly felt immense, a tangible anchor to a future that was now utterly uncertain. She turned away, the opulent room spinning around her, the air thick with perfume and betrayal. She couldn't stay. Every saccharine smile, every flash of light, every whispered compliment directed at the new couple felt like a stab. She needed to escape, to breathe, to figure out what to do next. But as she moved to leave, a familiar voice, sharp and cutting, sliced through the din. "Isabella, is that you?" Her blood ran cold. It was Eleanor Vance, Serena's mother, a woman Isabella had known casually through various charity committees. Eleanor, a formidable socialite with an unwavering gaze, stood barely 10 feet away, a glass of Chardonnay in hand, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Isabella froze, her heart hammering. The last thing she needed was a confrontation. Eleanor, a woman who had clearly mastered the art of observation, slowly walked towards Isabella, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing vaguely. "I thought I recognized that distinctive black wrap, and you're not usually one for hiding in the shadows, dear. Where's Richard?" Her voice, though superficially polite, carried an undercurrent of something sharp, almost predatory. Isabella's mind raced. Deny everything? Pretend she was just a guest? No, Eleanor was too shrewd. "Good evening, Eleanor," Isabella managed, forcing a polite smile that felt brittle. "Richard is around. I just stepped away for a moment." She gestured vaguely towards the main ballroom, hoping to divert Eleanor's gaze, but Eleanor's eyes, bright and knowing, remained fixed on her. "Yes, he certainly is around. With my Serena, I believe. They make quite a striking couple, don't they?" A triumphant smirk played on her lips. "Such a shame about your delicate condition. It's hard to compete with youth and vibrancy, isn't it?" Isabella felt a flush creep up her neck. Delicate condition? Had she guessed? Or was it just a cruel jab at her recent weight gain? She clasped her hands, nails digging into her palms. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Eleanor." Eleanor merely chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Oh dear, Isabella, you're far too intelligent to be playing innocent. Richard and Serena, well, let's just say their connection has been blossoming for quite some time. My daughter is a passionate woman, and Richard, it seems, appreciates that." She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving Isabella's. "You know, Serena has always admired Richard, his drive, his ambition, his ability to provide." The last words were delivered with a pointed emphasis, a thinly veiled reference to Isabella's own status as a trophy wife, a silent accusation of her perceived inadequacy. The words stung, igniting a spark of defiance in Isabella. She wouldn't let Eleanor see her crumble. "Our marriage, Eleanor, is not something you understand, and my condition, as you so delicately put it, is my own private affair." Eleanor's smile widened, devoid of warmth. "Indeed, just as my daughter's affections for your husband are now very much public." She paused, her gaze sweeping over Isabella, lingering on her slightly rounded middle. "You know, Richard is a powerful man, Isabella. He's used to getting what he wants, and what he wants, it seems, is new. Exciting." She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You really should have kept a closer eye on him. Men like Richard, They need constant stimulation. And a pregnant wife, well, that's hardly stimulating, is it? The sheer audacity of the woman, the brutal frankness of her cruelty, momentarily stunned Isabella into silence. Her heart pounded, a furious drum. How could she, another woman, speak with such venom and disregard for her pain? "Excuse me," Isabella finally managed, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "I have no further interest in this conversation." She turned sharply, intending to make a swift exit, but Eleanor's voice followed her, a parting shot. "Just remember, Isabella, in this world, the strong survive. And sometimes, dear, that means knowing when to gracefully step aside." Isabella fled, the encounter leaving her shaken and furious. Eleanor's words, though cruel, had laid bare the unspoken power dynamics at play. Richard was the powerful, wealthy man, and Serena, with her youth and rising fame, was the new, exciting acquisition. And Isabella, the discarded wife, was expected to simply fade away. She found herself in the grand foyer, the massive crystal chandeliers sparkling like frozen tears above her. The air felt suffocating. She needed to get out. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling, to call her driver. As she waited, she saw Richard and Serena being escorted out a side entrance by his security detail, clearly leaving the gala early. Serena was laughing, her head thrown back, her emerald dress shimmering. Richard looked utterly captivated. A cold, hard resolve began to crystallize within Isabella. This wasn't just about a broken heart. It was about public humiliation, about a betrayal so profound it threatened to erase her very identity. And now, with Eleanor's cruel words ringing in her ears, she realized this wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a public battle for dignity, for respect, for her future, and for the unborn child she carried. She wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't gracefully step aside. She would fight. The days following the gala were a blur of pain, anger, and a desperate sense of strategic planning. Isabella had retreated to a small, unassuming cottage she owned in a quiet coastal town, a place she often escaped to when the pressures of Richard's world became too much. It was a haven, a place where she could shed the expectations of being Mrs. Richard Thorne and simply be Isabella. Now, it was her sanctuary, her war room. She called her best friend Sarah Jenkins, a sharp-witted attorney with a no-nonsense attitude and a heart of gold. Sarah listened patiently, her anger palpable even through the phone line. He did what? Publicly? The absolute nerve of that man. And Eleanor Vance? That viper. Isabella, you cannot let them get away with this. Isabella, pacing the worn wooden floorboards of the cottage, recounted the gala, Eleanor's cutting remarks, and the crushing realization that her marriage was not just over, but annihilated in the most brutal way imaginable. "I'm 6 months pregnant, Sarah. He left me, pregnant, for a celebrity. And his mother-in-law-to-be practically told me to disappear." Sarah's voice was firm. "Then we make them regret ever thinking you'd disappear. You have rights, Isabella, significant rights, and a baby changes everything." Together they began to plot. Isabella decided on a complete vanishing act. No dramatic confrontation, no tearful pleas, no public outcry. Not yet. She would simply cease to exist in Richard's world. She closed down her social media, changed her phone number, and instructed her staff to forward all mail to Sarah's office. She liquidated some personal assets, enough to ensure her financial independence for a substantial period, severing any remaining financial ties to Richard's immediate control. The first step was to deliver the news of her pregnancy, not to Richard directly, but through a formal, legal channel. Sarah drafted a letter, stark and unemotional, informing Richard of her pregnancy and her intention to seek full custody and substantial child support, along with an equitable division of their marital assets. It was a declaration of war, delivered with the cold precision of a legal document. Weeks turned into a month. Richard's initial attempts to contact Isabella were sporadic, seemingly perfunctory. He left a few voicemails, all variations of, "Isabella, where are you? We need to talk about the separation agreement." There was no mention of the gala, no apology, no real concern. He sounded annoyed, inconvenienced. Then Sarah delivered the pregnancy letter. The calls stopped for a few days, replaced by increasingly frantic messages from his attorneys. "Mrs. Thorne, Mr. Thorne is extremely distressed by these allegations. He requires immediate contact with you. Mrs. Thorne, this is a very serious matter. We advise you to respond to our client's inquiries without delay." Isabella felt a grim satisfaction. He was finally feeling the consequences of his actions. She remained silent, allowing Sarah to handle all communications. Her focus was entirely on her unborn child, on preparing for their new life, and on building her strength, both physical and emotional. She embraced the quiet solitude of the cottage, walking on the beach, reading, and meticulously planning for motherhood. Sarah relayed the updates. Richard was, predictably, furious. He denied paternity, demanded a DNA test, and accused Isabella of attempting to extort him. His legal team launched a barrage of motions, attempting to locate Isabella to force her appearance. But Isabella, under Sarah's careful guidance, remained elusive, a ghost in the machine of Richard's meticulously ordered life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Isabella sat on the porch of the cottage, a cup of herbal tea warming her hands. She scrolled through an old photo album on her tablet, images of her and Richard from happier times, their wedding day, their honeymoon in Italy, his arm around her at various charity events, smiles frozen in time. A pang of grief, sharp and visceral, twisted in her gut. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the loss of the future she had envisioned, the family she had believed they were building. She touched the screen, a photo of Richard holding her close, whispering something in her ear, her laugh genuine and full of joy. What had gone wrong? When had the warmth in his eyes turned cold? When had she become so insignificant? A sudden push from within her belly, a strong, undeniable kick, brought her back to the present. Her baby. This tiny, growing life was her future, her reason, her strength. Richard's betrayal had stripped her of her past, but it would not define her future. She would rise from the ashes of her shattered marriage, stronger, fiercer, and more determined than ever. Months passed. Isabella gave birth to a healthy baby girl, Lily, a tiny bundle of perfection who instantly filled the void in her heart. Lily's arrival solidified Isabella's resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about protecting her daughter, ensuring she had a stable, loving environment, free from the shadow of her father's public indiscretions. Richard's legal team, still unable to locate Isabella directly, had been forced to deal solely with Sarah. The DNA test had been meticulously arranged through a neutral third party, the results delivered directly to the court. The paternity was undeniable. Richard Thorne was Lily's father. The legal battle escalated, turning into a bitter, drawn-out war. Richard, initially arrogant and dismissive, had become increasingly enraged. The public narrative, carefully managed by his PR team, was that Isabella was a manipulative gold digger attempting to exploit his wealth. He appeared in carefully curated interviews, expressing his concern for Isabella's well-being, while subtly painting her as unstable and unreliable. He and Serena were a constant fixture in the tabloids, a golden couple, their romance blooming under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. But Isabella had a secret weapon: time. Time to heal, time to plan, and time to observe. She devoured every news article, every social media post, every piece of gossip about Richard and Serena. She learned about his business dealings, his public appearances, his new ventures. She began to see patterns, vulnerabilities, and potential weaknesses. One afternoon, as Lily napped in her crib, Isabella sat at her laptop, a determined glint in her eyes. She had always been intelligent, meticulous, and resourceful, skills she had quietly honed managing Richard's household and social calendar, skills he had long underestimated. Now, she was putting them to use. She began compiling a dossier, not just legal documents, but a comprehensive record of Richard's public and private life since their separation. Every photo of him and Serena, every gushing interview, every public display of affection. She cross-referenced financial statements, public filings, and even innocuous social media posts from Serena's inner circle. She noticed inconsistencies, small but significant details that hinted at something deeper than just a romantic affair. One particular detail caught her attention: a series of investments Richard had made in a struggling media company that suddenly, coincidentally, began producing projects starring Serena Vance. Another, the rapid promotion of certain executives within Thorn Enterprises who had personal ties to Serena's family. It was all circumstantial, but it pointed to a pattern of leveraging his corporate power for personal gain and to further Serena's career. Sarah, reviewing Isabella's meticulous findings, raised an eyebrow. "Isabella, this is thorough. Very thorough. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Richard Thorn isn't just a cheating husband, Sarah. I think he's using his company, his influence, to prop up Serena's career, potentially at the expense of his shareholders, or even through questionable means. And I think Eleanor Vance is orchestrating a lot of it." Isabella's voice was calm, devoid of the raw emotion that had once consumed her. It was replaced by a cold, strategic precision. Sarah leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "If we can prove corporate malfeasance, or even just a blatant conflict of interest that impacts the company's value, it changes the entire dynamic of our divorce settlement. It could also make his public image, the one he's so carefully cultivated, utterly crumble. The idea of exposing Richard, not just as a philanderer, but as a man who abused his power, sent a thrill through Isabella. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about justice. It was about showing the world the true face of the man who had so casually discarded her and their unborn child. "But how do we prove it?" Sarah asked, tapping a pen against the table. "These are high-level dealings, not easily accessible to an outsider." Isabella smiled, a genuine, almost predatory smile that hadn't graced her lips in months. "Richard may think he knows me, Sarah, but he never truly saw me. He saw a wife, a homemaker, a pretty face to accompany him to galas. He never saw the woman who meticulously managed his life, who had access to every corner of his world, who knew his routines, his confidants, and even his blind spots." She paused, her eyes glinting with a newfound strength. "He made a mistake, Sarah. He underestimated me. He forgot that even in a gilded cage, a lioness still retains her claws." The battle lines were drawn. Isabella, no longer a vanishing wife, was a formidable opponent. With Sarah's legal expertise and Isabella's intimate knowledge of Richard's world, they began to chip away at his carefully constructed facade. Their first move was to formally petition the court for a temporary restraining order, citing Richard's continued harassment and attempts to disparage Isabella in the media. This was a strategic play, forcing Richard's legal team to focus on a new front, and giving Isabella a much-needed shield from his relentless public relations attacks. The judge, swayed by the meticulously documented evidence of Richard's public statements and the recent DNA confirmation of Lily's paternity, granted the order. The media, who had been fed a narrative of Isabella as a disgruntled ex-wife, suddenly found themselves with a more complex story. Next, Sarah subpoenaed financial records related to the media company investments and the promotions within Thorn Enterprises. Richard's lawyers fought tooth and nail, claiming these were unrelated to the divorce proceedings. But Sarah argued, persuasively, that Richard's personal conduct and potential misuse of corporate assets had a direct bearing on the division of marital property and his fitness as a parent. The pressure mounted on Richard. His public appearances became less frequent, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a strained smile and darting eyes. Serena, too, seemed to be feeling the heat. Her social media posts, once frequent and carefree, became less ebullient, more curated. The image of the golden couple began to show cracks. One day, an anonymous package arrived at Sarah's office. Inside, a USB drive. On it, a series of encrypted emails and internal company memos. Isabella recognized the sender's alias. It belonged to a junior executive at Thorn Enterprises, a young woman Isabella had always been kind to, a woman who had quietly expressed discomfort with some of Richard's more ethically ambiguous decisions. The emails confirmed Isabella's suspicions. Richard had indeed used company funds and resources to artificially inflate Serena's career, bypassing ethical guidelines and potentially defrauding shareholders. The evidence was damning. It wasn't just a conflict of interest, it bordered on corporate fraud. With this new evidence, Sarah filed an amended petition, alleging Richard's financial misconduct and demanding a comprehensive forensic audit of Thorn Enterprises. This was no longer just a divorce, it was a potential criminal investigation. The news hit the tabloids like a bombshell. Thorn Enterprises under scrutiny. Millionaire mogul accused of fraud in bitter divorce battle. The narrative shifted dramatically. Richard Thorn, once the untouchable tech titan, was now a man facing serious legal and ethical challenges. His carefully crafted image of a benevolent visionary crumbled, replaced by accusations of greed and malfeasance. The public, fickle as always, turned against him. Serena Vance, once admired as the new it girl, found her career stalling. Film offers dwindled, endorsement deals were pulled, and the paparazzi, once clamoring for her photos, now hurled questions about Richard's integrity. Her Instagram comments, once filled with fawning praise, were now rife with accusations of being a homewrecker and an accomplice. Isabella, watching from her quiet sanctuary, felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. This wasn't the Richard she had married, the man she had loved. This was a man consumed by power and ego, a man who had sacrificed everything, including his integrity, for fleeting gratification. One afternoon her phone rang. It was Richard. His voice, once arrogant and dismissive, was now tinged with desperation. "Isabella, please, we need to talk. This is getting out of control. Your lawyer is destroying my life, my company." Isabella listened, a cold satisfaction settling over her. "You destroyed our life, Richard. And now you're facing the consequences of your own actions. But Lily, think about Lily. Do you want her to grow up with a father facing criminal charges? Think of the scandal." He was playing the victim, trying to manipulate her with their daughter. "You should have thought about Lily, Richard, when you abandoned your pregnant wife and paraded your mistress in front of the entire city. You should have thought about Lily when you compromised your company's ethics. This isn't about me destroying your life, Richard. This is about you facing the truth of who you've become." She hung up, her hand trembling slightly. It was a victory, a significant one. but it was also a stark reminder of the wreckage he had created. The path to redemption for Richard seemed impossible, perhaps even undeserved. But for Isabella, it was just the beginning of reclaiming her own life, on her own terms, with her daughter by her side. The pressure on Richard became unbearable. Shareholders were demanding answers. The board of directors initiated an internal investigation, and the district attorney's office was rumored to be looking into the fraud allegations. Serena Vance, finding her career in tatters and her reputation ruined, finally broke. She contacted Sarah, requesting a private meeting. Isabella, though wary, agreed. The meeting took place in Sarah's office, a stark, modern space that offered no comfort. Serena walked in, a shadow of her former glamorous self. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her designer clothes looked rumpled, and the confident sparkle was gone. She looked afraid. "I need to tell you everything," Serena whispered, her voice hoarse. "I can't do this anymore. He's going to drag me down with him." Isabella watched her, a mix of pity and cold anger churning within her. This woman had stolen her husband, paraded her infidelity, and now she was looking for a way out, a way to save herself. Serena began to speak, a torrent of confession pouring out of her. She admitted that the affair had started almost a year before the Gala, cultivated by Eleanor Vance, who saw Richard as a lucrative target for her daughter's career. Eleanor had orchestrated meetings, encouraged Serena to pursue him relentlessly, and even coached her on how to appeal to Richard's ego and desire for novelty. "My mother, she pushed me," Serena explained, tears streaming down her face. "She said it was my big break, that Richard could make me a superstar. She said Isabella was old news, a tired wife who didn't appreciate him." Isabella felt a fresh wave of disgust. Eleanor Vance, the architect of her destruction. Serena then detailed Richard's increasingly desperate attempts to secure roles for her, funneling money from Thorn Enterprises into struggling production companies in exchange for Serena's casting. She described how Richard had instructed her to actively promote his businesses on her social media, blurring ethical lines and creating a false sense of endorsement. She even admitted to faking certain social media posts to make their romance seem more genuine and impactful to the public. "He was so caught up in the fantasy," Serena said, wiping her eyes. "He loved the idea of the powerful CIO with the beautiful famous actress on his arm. And I loved the attention, the opportunities. But then you disappeared, and the baby news came out, and everything started to fall apart. My career is ruined. I get hate mail every day. He's a monster." Isabella listened, her face impassive. She felt no satisfaction in Serena's misery, only a hollow ache. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about holding Richard accountable for his actions, and about finding peace for herself and Lily. "What do you want, Serena?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and professional. "Immunity," Serena pleaded, looking at Isabella. "I'll testify. I'll give you everything. Emails, texts, recordings. I have it all. My mother even bragged about some of their schemes. I just want out. I want to save what's left of my life." Isabella looked at Sarah. "Can we trust her?" Sarah hesitated. "Her testimony, coupled with the evidence you already have, would be devastating to Richard. It would effectively end his career and potentially lead to criminal charges. But we need to verify everything she provides." Isabella finally spoke directly to Serena. "If you lie, if you omit anything, if you try to protect him or your mother, we will not hesitate to expose you as an accomplice. Do you understand?" Serena nodded frantically. "I understand. I promise. I'll tell the truth." The meeting concluded with an agreement. Serena would cooperate fully, providing all evidence and testimony. In return, Sarah would advocate for a lenient plea deal for Serena, provided her information was accurate, and led to a successful prosecution of Richard. Leaving Sarah's office, Isabella felt a heavy weight lift from her shoulders. The psychological torment of Richard's betrayal, the public humiliation, the fight for her daughter's future. It all coalesced into a clear path forward. The truth was about to be laid bare, and Richard Thorne would finally face the music. The courtroom was packed, a tangible buzz of anticipation filling the air. Journalists jostled for seats, sketching furiously in notebooks, their lenses glinting. Richard Thorne, flanked by a phalanx of high-powered attorneys, looked significantly older, his face etched with worry. His once impeccable suit now seemed to hang slightly on his frame. Serena Vance, looking pale and subdued, sat separately, her presence a silent testament to the unraveling of Richard's world. Isabella, serene and composed, sat beside Sarah, holding Lily's tiny hand in hers, a symbol of her renewed strength. The trial began, a relentless barrage of evidence. Sarah, a master of courtroom drama, presented the meticulously compiled dossier. Financial records flashed across the large screen, highlighting the suspicious investments and the inflated budgets for projects starring Serena. Internal emails were read aloud, revealing Richard's instructions to manipulate corporate resources for personal gain. Then came Serena's testimony. She recounted the affair with chilling detail, her voice cracking as she confessed to her part in the deception. She provided recordings of conversations with Richard, where he openly discussed leveraging his company to boost her career, and even detailed some of Eleanor Vance's conniving plans. Eleanor, observing from the gallery, looked livid, her face a mask of fury. Richard's lawyers tried to discredit Serena, painting her as a jilted lover seeking revenge, but her testimony was corroborated by the overwhelming documentary evidence. They also tried to portray Isabella as a vengeful ex-wife, but Sarah countered with a powerful narrative of a woman abandoned, publicly humiliated, and forced to fight for her dignity and her child's future. Isabella took the stand, her voice clear and steady. She spoke of her marriage, her love for Richard, and the crushing betrayal at the Gala. She spoke of her pregnancy, her fear, and her determination to protect Lily. She showed photos of Lily, healthy and beautiful, her birth certificate clearly listing Richard as the father. Her testimony was devoid of theatrics, just a quiet, dignified telling of her truth. Under cross-examination, Richard's attorney tried to corner her, questioning her motives, her financial independence. But Isabella, prepared by Sarah, remained calm, answering each question with unflappable logic and grace. The pivotal moment came when Sarah called Richard Thorne to the stand. He was arrogant at first, denying the allegations, attempting to deflect blame. But under Sarah's relentless questioning, the cracks in his composure began to show. She presented him with his own emails, his own financial records, his own words from the recordings Serena had provided. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah's voice rang through the courtroom, "isn't it true that you knowingly used Thorne Enterprises funds to advance Miss Vance's acting career, thereby committing a blatant conflict of interest and potentially defrauding your shareholders?" Richard stammered, his face turning beet red. I was supporting her career. She's a talented actress. At the expense of your company's integrity? At the expense of your marital vows? At the expense of your reputation?" Sarah pressed, her voice unwavering. "And isn't it true that you abandoned your pregnant wife, Mrs. Thorne, at the very same time you were publicly flaunting Miss Vance, causing her immense emotional distress and humiliation?" Richard looked at Isabella, really looked at her, for the first time in months. His eyes, once dismissive, now held a flicker of something akin to shame, or perhaps just fear of consequences. He mumbled, I made mistakes. Mistakes, Mr. Thorne, Sarah countered, or calculated choices that benefited you and Ms. Vance at the cost of everyone else. The weight of the evidence, the relentless questioning, and the undeniable truth of his actions finally broke him. Richard Thorne, the formidable tech mogul, crumbled on the stand. He admitted to the affair, to the misuse of company funds, to his callous treatment of Isabella. He confessed to prioritizing his ego and his new relationship over his responsibilities as a husband, a father, and a CEO. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. The judge, after a tense silence, called for a recess. Isabella felt a profound sense of closure. The truth was out. The lies were exposed. Richard's empire, built on ambition and now stained by deceit, was crumbling. It wasn't a triumphant feeling, but a quiet, solemn one. The battle had been long and arduous, but justice, it seemed, was finally within reach. The aftermath of the trial was swift and decisive. Richard Thorne faced multiple civil lawsuits from shareholders and was forced to resign as CEO of Thorne Enterprises. He was hit with substantial fines and community service, and his public image was irreparably damaged. His fortune, once seemingly limitless, was significantly diminished by legal fees and settlements. Eleanor Vance, implicated in Serena's testimony, faced her own legal troubles and public condemnation, her social standing in tatters. Serena, thanks to her cooperation, received a lighter sentence and began the difficult process of rebuilding her life and career, far away from the spotlight. Isabella, on the other hand, emerged from the wreckage with her dignity intact, her reputation restored, and her future shining brightly. The court granted her full custody of Lily, with Richard having supervised visitation rights, a testament to his past actions and the need to protect their daughter. The divorce settlement was substantial, ensuring Isabella and Lily's financial security for life. But more than the financial gains, Isabella gained something invaluable: her self-worth. She had faced betrayal, humiliation, and a powerful adversary, and she had not only survived, but thrived. She had found her voice, asserted her strength, and fought for justice. She sold the sprawling mansion she had once shared with Richard, severing the last physical tie to her past life. With the proceeds and a portion of her settlement, she bought a beautiful, sun-drenched home in a vibrant, family-friendly neighborhood, far from the whispers of high society. Her relationship with Sarah deepened into an unbreakable bond. Sarah became not just her lawyer, but her closest confidant, her chosen family. One sunny afternoon, Isabella sat on the porch swing of her new home, Lily giggling in her lap. The little girl, now a boisterous toddler with Richard's dark hair, and Isabella's bright, inquisitive eyes, pointed at a butterfly flitting by. "Mama, Fluffy!" Isabella hugged her daughter tightly, a wave of profound love washing over her. This was her redemption. This was her deeply satisfying conclusion. She had built a new life, a life filled with genuine love, peace, and authenticity. She was no longer Mrs. Richard Thorne, the abandoned wife. She was Isabella, a strong, resilient mother, charting her own course. She thought of the Gala, the night her world had shattered. She thought of the pain, the betrayal, the humiliation, but she also thought of the strength it had ignited within her, the courage it had given her to fight, and the path it had forged towards this beautiful, new beginning. Richard occasionally saw Lily during supervised visits. He was a quieter man now, humbled and subdued. There was no animosity between them, just a quiet, almost sad understanding. He had lost everything that truly mattered, and Isabella, by losing him, had gained her true self. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over her new home, Isabella smiled. Her life was far from perfect, but it was real. It was hers, and it was just beginning. She had walked through fire and emerged stronger, more whole, and profoundly grateful for the lessons learned and the love found. If you found Isabella's journey inspiring, if her courage resonated with your own experiences of overcoming adversity, please like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of resilience and empowerment. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to life. Thank you for watching.
Imagine this. You're 7 months pregnant, alone in a Paris hospital, and your millionaire husband walks out on you during labor on purpose. He's not just leaving, he's setting a trap. But what he doesn't know is that you're about to rise from the ashes, take over an empire, and make him regret the day he underestimated you. This is the true story of betrayal, revenge, and a $212 million secret. And it all started in one hospital room. Stay with me until the end, because the final twist will leave you speechless. If you love stories of jaw-dropping comebacks, hit that like button, drop a comment, share this with a friend, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because you're about to hear how the phoenix rose. The monitors beeped steadily in the sterile room of Saint-Antoine Hospital, their rhythm suddenly interrupted by Margaret Sullivan's sharp gasp. She gripped the bed rails, her knuckles white against the metal. Outside, Paris glittered in the evening darkness, but inside this room, her world was collapsing. "Richard, the baby is coming early," Margaret said, her voice strained with pain and fear. At 43, she had thought this pregnancy was her miracle, their chance to save a 20-year marriage that had been slowly unraveling. Her husband stood by the window, checking his phone. Richard Sullivan, 52, with his perfectly styled silver hair and $1,000 suit, didn't even look up. "I have a board meeting in New York tomorrow morning," he said, his tone as cold as the December air outside. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're leaving me here in Paris." The contraction peaked, and she had to breathe through it before continuing. "Richard, I'm only 7 months along. This is dangerous." "You'll be fine," Richard said, already gathering his briefcase. "The doctors here are competent enough." A nurse entered, her soft French accent filling the room. "Madam Sullivan, we must prepare for delivery. The baby, she is coming whether we are ready or not." Richard was already at the door. "I'll have Mark Stevens contact you about the paperwork." "What paperwork?" Margaret called after him. But another contraction stole her breath. "Just some financial matters," Richard said without turning around. "Nothing you need to worry about right now." The nurse, whose name tag read Sophie, moved to Margaret's side, checking monitors with practiced efficiency. "Your husband, he is leaving," she asked gently. Margaret nodded, unable to speak as tears mixed with sweat on her face. She thought about the prenup she had signed 20 years ago, young and in love, never imagining she would need to remember its contents. She thought about how Richard had insisted she come to Paris alone for her art exhibition, claiming he had too much work to accompany her. The exhibition that now seemed like a carefully orchestrated trap. "Madam, you must focus," Sophie said kindly. "Your daughter needs you to be strong." Daughter. Margaret held on to that word as Richard's footsteps echoed down the hospital corridor, each step taking him further away from his family. She had spent 2 decades supporting his career, hosting his dinner parties, charming his clients, putting her own art career on hold to be the perfect corporate wife. She had endured 3 miscarriages, countless fertility treatments, and the cruel whispers at country club events about her empty womb. "I'm alone," Margaret whispered. Sophie squeezed her hand. "Non, madame, you are not alone. We are here." As the contraction peaked, Margaret realized she had never been more alone or more determined. Her millionaire ex-husband might have abandoned her, but she would not abandon herself. She had $10,000 in her personal emergency fund, a talent for painting that had once shown promise, and now, a daughter who would need her to be stronger than she had ever been. The doctor entered, speaking rapid French to Sophie before switching to accented English. "Mrs. Sullivan, the baby is in distress. We must perform an emergency cesarean." Margaret nodded, her mind surprisingly clear despite the pain. "Do whatever you need to do. Save my daughter." As they wheeled her toward the operating room, Margaret caught a glimpse of her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, hollow-eyed, frightened, abandoned. But somewhere beneath the fear, she saw something else. A spark of anger, a seed of determination. Richard had left her with nothing but medical bills in a foreign country. He had walked out during her most vulnerable moment, probably heading straight to whatever younger woman had caught his attention this time. After 20 years of marriage, he couldn't even pretend to care long enough to see his daughter born. The anesthesia mask covered her face, and as the world began to fade, Margaret made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would protect her daughter, and somehow, some way, she would make Richard Sullivan regret the day he walked out of this hospital room. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Sophie's gentle voice. "Courage, madame. Tomorrow is a new day." If only Margaret had known how prophetic those words would prove to be. 6 hours later, as dawn broke over Paris, painting the hospital room in soft pink light, Margaret woke to find Sophie adjusting her IV. The young nurse smiled when she saw Margaret's eyes flutter open. "Madam Sullivan, your daughter is stable in the incubator," Sophie said softly. "She is small but fierce, like her mother." Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. "Can I see her?" "Of course, but first—" Sophie hesitated, wringing her hands. "There is also a gentleman asking for you. He says he is your husband's attorney." Margaret's stomach dropped. Through the fog of pain medication, she tried to make sense of this. "Attorney, is Richard back? Is he handling the medical insurance?" Sophie helped Margaret into a wheelchair, her movements gentle but her expression troubled. "I do not think so, madam. This man, he seems uncomfortable." They wheeled past the nursery first, where Margaret saw her daughter for the first time. Tiny, perfect, with a surprising amount of dark hair. The baby lay in the incubator, fighting for every breath. Margaret pressed her hand against the glass, tears streaming down her face. "What will you name her?" Sophie asked. "Emma," Margaret whispered. "After my grandmother. She was the strongest woman I ever knew." "A beautiful name for a beautiful fighter," Sophie said. "Now, shall we meet this attorney?" Mark Stevens stood in the hallway like a man facing execution. His expensive suit couldn't hide his discomfort as he clutched his briefcase with white knuckles. He was younger than Margaret expected, probably early 30s, with nervous eyes behind designer glasses. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began in measured tones, not quite meeting her eyes. "I've been instructed to inform you that Mr. Sullivan has initiated divorce proceedings." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She gripped the wheelchair arms, her IV line pulling tight. "He couldn't even wait until I delivered," Stevens shifted uncomfortably. "The papers were filed yesterday evening, New York time, approximately 3 hours after he left the hospital." 3 hours, Margaret repeated numbly. It took him 3 hours to decide 20 years meant nothing. "There's more," Stevens continued, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "He's claiming abandonment since you chose to stay in Paris for your art exhibition. He states that you refused to return home when requested, and that this constitutes willful desertion of the marriage." Margaret's shock transformed into something sharper. She thought about the exhibition, Richard's idea, Richard's insistence she go alone. He had even chosen the gallery, made all the arrangements, insisted it would be good for her to have some independence. "He planned this," she said, her voice growing stronger. "The exhibition, sending me here alone, all of it." Stevens didn't deny it. Instead, he placed a folder on her lap. "The initial settlement offer, Mr. Sullivan is proposing you receive the Connecticut house and $50,000 annually in alimony." Margaret opened the folder, her artist's eye immediately catching the discrepancies. "The Connecticut house has a mortgage, and $50,000 a year. Richard makes that in 2 days. Mr. Sullivan's position is that you have your own career as an artist," Stevens said weakly. "A career he made me abandon," Margaret shot back. "I haven't sold a painting in 5 years because he needed me at every corporate event, every dinner party, every—" She stopped, breathing hard. The incision from her C-section throbbed with each word. Sophie stepped forward protectively. "Perhaps Monsieur Stevens could return later when Madame is stronger." but Margaret raised her hand. No, I want to hear it all. What about Emma? What about our daughter? Stevens looked even more uncomfortable. Mr. Sullivan is prepared to pay child support as required by law. The minimum amount based on the calculation. The minimum, Margaret interrupted. Of course, and custody. He's not seeking any custodial rights. He's prepared to sign away parental claims in exchange for reduced financial obligations. The room spun. Margaret closed her eyes, hearing Richard's voice from years ago. Children would just interfere with my career trajectory. She had been so young, so eager to please, agreeing that they would wait. Now, after years of fertility treatments he had grudgingly funded, after the miracle of Emma's conception, he was walking away from his own child like she was a bad investment. Mrs. Sullivan, Stevens prompted. Do you have any questions? Margaret opened her eyes, and something in her expression made Stevens take a step back. Just one. Did Richard mention that he changed all our joint account passwords while I was in labor? Stevens paled. That would be illegal. Marital assets are frozen until the divorce is final. Yes, Margaret finished. So how exactly am I supposed to pay for this hospital, for Emma's care for a plane ticket home? I wasn't aware, Stevens began. Of course you weren't, Margaret said quietly. Richard never tells anyone the whole truth. He just moves the pieces around his board and expects everyone else to figure out the game. Sophie cleared her throat. Monsieur Stevens, I think you should leave now. As Stevens gathered his briefcase, Margaret called after him. Tell Richard something for me. The attorney paused at the door. Tell him thank you, Margaret said. Stevens looked confused. Thank you for finally showing me exactly who he is, Margaret replied, and for teaching me that narcissistic abuse doesn't always come with raised voices and violence. Sometimes it comes with calculated cruelty and designer suits. After Stevens left, Sophie wheeled Margaret back to her room in silence. The young nurse helped her back into bed, adjusting pillows with practiced care. Madam Sullivan, Sophie said gently, the hospital billing department will need to speak with you. Margaret laughed bitterly. I have $10,000 to my name. Emma's NICU care alone will cost more than that per day. One, there are payment plans, assistance programs. For a 43-year-old American woman with a $10,000 emergency fund, Margaret shook her head. I need to call my sister. Maybe she can… Madam, Sophie interrupted. There is a woman who has been waiting to see you. She says she overheard your conversation with the attorney. She would like to help. Margaret frowned. I don't know anyone in Paris except the gallery owner. She is not from Paris. She is… Sophie searched for words. She is formidable. That afternoon, as Parisian rain drummed against the windows, Margaret heard confident footsteps approaching her room. The woman who entered commanded attention without trying, silver hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a simple but expensive black dress, moving with the assurance of someone who had never met a room she couldn't own. Margaret Sullivan. The woman's voice carried a slight Boston accent, cultured but with steel underneath. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I own this hospital. Margaret struggled to sit up straighter, wincing at the pull of her incision. I don't understand. Eleanor pulled a chair close to the bed, her movements efficient. I was in the hallway this morning, not intentionally eavesdropping, but that attorney of your husband's has a voice that carries. I heard everything he said. I'm sorry for the disturbance. Don't apologize. Eleanor cut her off. I've been where you are. Different circumstances, but the same betrayal, the same financial manipulation, the same narcissistic ex-husband who thought he could destroy me and walk away laughing. Margaret studied the older woman's face. Eleanor appeared to be in her early 60s, with the kind of bone structure that suggested old money and good genes. But there was something in her eyes that spoke of battles fought and won. You said you own this hospital, Margaret asked. Eleanor nodded. This one and 11 others across Europe. It's taken me 15 years to build this medical empire after my own divorce nearly destroyed me. She leaned forward. I know Richard Sullivan by reputation. Hostile takeovers are his specialty. He's very good at what he does, Margaret admitted. Eleanor laughed, a rich sound that filled the room. So am I, and I have a proposition for you. Margaret felt like she was in a dream, perhaps still foggy from the pain medication. A proposition, Mrs. Whitmore. I appreciate your concern, but I have nothing to offer anyone right now. I'm a 43-year-old woman with a newborn in the NICU and $10,000 to my name. Eleanor, please. And you're wrong about having nothing to offer. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked city. This hospital is part of a medical chain I'm selling. I've had several offers, including one from a consortium that your husband represents. Margaret's heart sank. Of course he does. Eleanor turned back to her. But I'd rather sell it to someone who understands what it means to be vulnerable. Someone who knows what it's like to be dismissed and abandoned in their moment of greatest need. I don't understand, Margaret said. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you an empire. Eleanor replied simply. But first I need to tell you something about your grandmother, Patricia Hartley. Margaret's breath caught. Grandmother, Patricia. She died when I was 5. I barely remember her. Eleanor smiled. She was my mentor, the first woman to serve on the board of Massachusetts General Hospital. She taught me that women supporting women wasn't just a nice idea, it was a revolution waiting to happen. I remember my father saying she was difficult, Margaret said slowly, that she had too many opinions. She had exactly the right number of opinions, Eleanor corrected, including one about your father. She knew he would waste any inheritance, spend it on bad investments and younger women. So she did something clever. Eleanor pulled a leather folder from her bag and placed it on Margaret's lap. She left you something in trust, something that could only be accessed when you truly needed it. The conditions were very specific: abandonment by spouse, life-threatening medical situation, or complete financial devastation. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the folder. The number at the bottom of the page didn't make sense. She counted the zeros twice. $200 million, she whispered. $212 million, with interest, Eleanor corrected. It's been waiting 38 years for this moment. This can't be real. Margaret looked up at Eleanor, tears streaming down her face. Why didn't anyone tell me? Your grandmother's instructions were very clear. You were to know nothing until the conditions were met. She didn't want you marrying for money or living your life waiting for an inheritance. She wanted you to become who you were meant to be first. Margaret thought about the woman she had been just yesterday, Richard's wife, hostess of his parties, the abandoned artist who painted in secret in the garage when he was traveling. That woman felt like a stranger now. Why are you helping me? Margaret asked. Eleanor sat back down, her expression softening. Because 15 years ago, when my husband left me for his 22-year-old secretary, I was you, except I didn't have a Patricia Hartley or an Eleanor Whitmore. I had to claw my way back from nothing, build my empire one acquisition at a time, prove that a 50-something woman could be more than what society said she was. She reached over and took Margaret's hand. You have a choice now. You can take your grandmother's money, sign whatever papers Richard wants, and disappear into comfortable obscurity. Or you can let me teach you what Patricia taught me, that the best revenge isn't living well. It's living strategically. Margaret looked toward the nursery where Emma was fighting for every breath. Her daughter would grow up in a world where her father had abandoned her before she was even born. But maybe, just maybe, she could grow up in a world where her mother had turned that abandonment into an empire. What would I need to do? Margaret asked. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since Richard had walked out, Margaret felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. First, you need to get well. Then, we're going to teach your narcissistic ex-husband a lesson about underestimating women. The medical contracts his companies depend on. 7 of them are with my facilities, and in about 6 weeks, they're going to belong to you. He'll fight it, Margaret warned. Richard doesn't like to lose. Good, Eleanor said, standing to leave. Neither do we. Rest now. Tomorrow, your education begins. Patricia Hartley's granddaughter is about to learn what financial independence after 50 really looks like. As Eleanor left, Margaret lay back against her pillows, her mind racing. This morning she had been an abandoned wife with nothing. Tonight, she was an heiress with a mentor and a plan. She thought about Richard, probably already back in New York, celebrating his freedom with whatever young woman had caught his attention. He thought he had played the perfect game sending her to Paris, filing for divorce while she was vulnerable, claiming abandonment to minimize his financial obligations. But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed Margaret was the same woman he had married 20 years ago, eager to please, afraid of conflict, willing to accept whatever scraps he offered. That woman had died in this hospital room when he walked out. The woman who remained was someone entirely new, someone her grandmother Patricia would have recognized. Someone who understood that midlife transformation wasn't about finding yourself, it was about finally becoming yourself. 3 days later, Margaret's phone buzzed with a voicemail as she sat feeding Emma in the NICU. She almost didn't listen to it, focused on her tiny daughter's improved breathing, the way her little fingers wrapped around Margaret's pinky with surprising strength. But something, perhaps instinct, made her tap play. Richard's voice filled her earbuds. That familiar tone of condescension that she now recognized had always been there, hidden under charm and expensive gifts. "Margaret, stop being dramatic. Sign the papers. You'll get your standard settlement, the Connecticut house, and $50,000 a year. That's generous considering." There was a giggle in the background, young and tinkling like champagne bubbles. Richard must not have realized his phone hadn't disconnected because the recording continued. "Richard, are you coming back to bed?" The woman's voice was young, probably mid-20s, with that breathy quality Richard had always found irresistible in everyone but his wife. "Just dealing with my ex." Richard's voice, muffled but clear. "She's being difficult about the divorce." "The pregnant one?" the girl asked. "I thought you said she was barren." Margaret's hands clenched so tightly that Emma made a small sound of protest. Barren. He had told this girl she was barren while she was in labor with his child. "She managed one at the last minute." Richard laughed. "Probably thought it would save the marriage. As if I'd stay tethered to a 43-year-old woman who let herself go just because she finally squeezed out a baby." "You're terrible," the girl giggled. "I'm practical. Ashley, darling, can you grab my blue tie? I have the Whitmore meeting this morning." Margaret hit stop, her hands shaking. Sophie, who had been adjusting Emma's monitors, noticed immediately. "Madame, are you all right? You look pale." Margaret pulled out her earbuds with trembling fingers. "Sophie, can you get Mrs. Whitmore on the phone? Tell her I want to discuss her proposition. Tell her I'm ready to learn everything." Sophie smiled. "Of course, madame. I will call immediately." As Sophie left, Margaret looked down at Emma, whose eyes were finally open, unfocused but definitely her father's shape. "Your daddy thinks we're worthless," she whispered. "He's about to learn how expensive that mistake will be." Eleanor arrived within the hour, bringing with her a team that looked like they had stepped out of a boardroom rather than into a hospital. There was Robert James, a British CFO with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit. Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman who radiated competence and wore her medical degree like armor. And Victoria Barnes, an attorney who made Mark Stevens look like a first-year law student. "Play the voicemail," Eleanor said simply. Margaret did, watching as each face in the room shifted from professional to disgusted. Victoria was actually taking notes, her pen flying across her legal pad. When it finished, Eleanor stood. "Gentleman's agreement is off. He wants to play dirty. We'll play strategic." Robert James pulled out his laptop. "The 7 medical facilities Mr. Sullivan's companies depend on their contracts are up for renewal in 6 weeks. We'll need Margaret trained and ready by then," Dr. Chen added. "She needs to understand not just the business side, but the medical operations." "I don't know anything about running hospitals," Margaret admitted. "You know about being dismissed and overlooked," Eleanor said firmly. "That's half of healthcare right there. The other half is just paperwork and profit margins. Robert will teach you the numbers. Sarah will teach you the operations. Victoria will teach you the law. And I'll teach you the most important lesson, how to turn pain into power." Victoria looked up from her notes. "That voicemail is evidence of abandonment and cruelty. We can use it." "No," Margaret said, surprising everyone, including herself. "Not yet. Let him think I'm still the same weak woman he left. When we strike, I want it to be a complete surprise." Eleanor smiled proudly. Patricia's strategic mind lives on. "Good, now let's discuss the Phoenix Fund." "The Phoenix Fund?" Margaret asked. "That's what your grandmother called your trust. She said money was just paper unless it was used to rise from ashes." Eleanor pulled out a thick folder. The full $212 million is available immediately, but there's more. Your grandmother also left detailed notes about Richard's business practices, things she observed when you first started dating him. Margaret took the folder, scanning her grandmother's neat handwriting. Notes about offshore accounts, questionable deal structures, patterns of behavior that suggested financial manipulation. She investigated him. Margaret breathed. She protected you the only way she could. Eleanor corrected. By gathering information and waiting for you to be ready to use it. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret's hospital room transformed into a classroom. While Emma grew stronger in the NICU, Margaret absorbed 20 years of business education in compressed time. She learned about EBITDA and acquisition strategies, about medical billing codes and insurance negotiations. She discovered she had a natural talent for seeing patterns in numbers, probably from years of managing household budgets on whatever allowance Richard deemed appropriate. Your husband's companies are hemorrhaging money, Robert informed her one afternoon, showing her a spreadsheet. They're completely dependent on our facilities for specialized testing. Without us, they lose 40% of their operational capacity. What would happen if we raised our prices? Margaret asked. Within contract limits, we could increase by 30%. And if we terminated the contracts, Robert smiled, they'd have to use competitors who charge 60% more and who are located much farther from their primary facilities. Transport costs alone would kill their margins. Margaret studied the numbers, seeing not just digits, but leverage. Each figure represented a choice Richard had made to prioritize profit over people. Now those choices would cost him. There's something else, Victoria said, entering with a new stack of papers. That young woman on the voicemail, Ashley Morrison. She's the daughter of Richard's biggest investor. Margaret looked up sharply. He's sleeping with his investor's daughter. 23 years old, fresh out of college, Victoria confirmed. If Morrison finds out, he won't, Margaret said. Not yet. We're going to let Richard think he's winning right up until the moment he loses everything. She looked around the room at these brilliant women who had materialized in her darkest hour, summoned by a grandmother she barely remembered, and a stranger who saw herself in Margaret's story. My millionaire ex-husband thinks I'm worthless, she said quietly. Let's show him what worthless women can accomplish. Eleanor raised her coffee cup in a toast. To the Phoenix Fund, to Patricia Hartley, and to women supporting women in the most devastating way possible through strategic revenge and superior business practices. As they toasted with coffee and orange juice, Emma made a small sound from her incubator, almost like agreement. Margaret went to her daughter, pressing her hand against the glass. Your great-grandmother would have loved you, she whispered. She would have loved what we're about to do even more. 1 week after giving birth, Margaret sat in Eleanor's office, a beautiful space overlooking the Seine. She moved carefully, her body still healing, but her mind was sharper than it had ever been. The past week of intensive education had awakened something in her that 20 years of marriage had nearly killed her ambition. The medical chain consists of 12 hospitals across Europe, Eleanor explained, spreading a map across her desk. Paris, London, Berlin, Rome, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and 6 others. Together, they generate $800 million in annual revenue. Margaret studied the map, seeing not just locations but a network of power. And Richard's companies depend on 7 of them. For specialized cardiac testing, oncology treatments, and rare disease protocols, Eleanor confirmed. His medical device companies need our facilities for trials. His pharmaceutical subsidiaries need our patient data for FDA approvals. We are, quite literally, the backbone of his medical empire. I know nothing about running hospitals, Margaret said honestly. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. You know about being dismissed and overlooked. Do you know how many women walk into emergency rooms with serious conditions only to be told they're being hysterical? How many female patients are prescribed antidepressants for physical ailments? How many mothers are ignored when they say something's wrong with their child? Margaret thought about her own experiences, the 3 miscarriages Richard had insisted were her fault for being too stressed, the fertility doctors who spoke only to Richard during appointments, the obstetrician in New York who had dismissed her concerns about early labor just 2 weeks before Emma's premature birth. Too many, she said quietly. Exactly. You don't need to know how to perform surgery. You need to know how to listen. The rest is just management. And believe me, if you can manage a millionaire ex-husband's ego for 20 years, you can manage anything. Eleanor stood and walked to a painting on the wall, an original Patricia Hartley. Margaret realized with a start, her grandmother had been an artist too, before she became a hospital board member. "There's something else," Eleanor said, pressing a hidden button. The painting swung open to reveal a safe. "Your grandmother left more than money. She left intelligence." She pulled out several thick folders, placing them carefully on the desk. Patricia served on multiple boards with Richard's mentors. She took notes on everything: business practices, personal scandals, financial vulnerabilities. She knew that information was the ultimate currency. Margaret opened the first folder, finding photographs, contracts, newspaper clippings. Her grandmother's neat handwriting covered the margins with observations and connections. "She knew what Richard was before I even married him," Margaret said, a mix of anger and awe in her voice. "She knew the type," Eleanor corrected. "Narcissistic, controlling, viewing wives as accessories and children as inconveniences. But she also knew you had to learn it for yourself. All she could do was prepare for the aftermath." The second folder contained financial records, offshore accounts, shell companies, a web of financial manipulation that would make any forensic accountant salivate. "Is this legal to have?" Margaret asked. Victoria, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "Everything here was obtained through public records and legal observation. Your grandmother was very careful. She knew that someday someone would need these weapons." "And now," Eleanor said, "we're going to teach you how to use them." "Robert." The CFO pulled out his laptop, turning it toward Margaret. "Your trust fund isn't just sitting in an account. Your grandmother invested it strategically. You own significant shares in 3 major medical supply companies, Richard's competitors." Margaret's eyes widened. "She bought shares in his competitors 20 years ago, when they were startups," Robert confirmed. "They're now worth 50 times what she paid. You're already a major player in the medical industry." "Margaret, you just didn't know it." Dr. Chen cleared her throat. "There's more. The research your grandmother funded, it led to 3 breakthrough treatments for pregnancy-related complications. Patents that generate $30 million annually in licensing fees. Patents that Richard's pharmaceutical company desperately wants to acquire." Margaret felt like she was drowning in information, but it was a different kind of drowning than the despair of a week ago. This was possibility threatening to overwhelm her. "Why didn't she use any of this when she was alive?" Margaret asked. Eleanor's expression softened. "Because she was saving it for someone who would use it right. She could have destroyed your father, could have revealed Richard's true nature before your wedding. But she believed in letting people make their own choices and learn their own lessons. She just made sure the tools for recovery would be waiting." Margaret stood carefully and walked to the window. Below, Paris bustled with life. Somewhere in New York, Richard was probably in a board meeting, confident that his discarded wife would quietly accept whatever crumbs he offered. He had no idea that his 43-year-old abandoned wife was about to become his worst nightmare. "How long do I have to learn everything?" she asked. 5 weeks until the contract renewals," Eleanor said. 5 weeks to transform from Richard Sullivan's discarded wife into the CEO of MedLife International. MedLife International. The new name for the hospital chain. Your first executive decision? Margaret turned back to the room full of brilliant women who had become her board of directors, her advisors, her army. "Then we'd better get started," she said. "I have a lot to learn and a millionaire ex-husband to destroy. Sorry to professionally outmaneuver." Eleanor laughed. "Oh, my dear, never apologize for ambition. Your grandmother would tell you that the best revenge is massive success. But she'd also tell you that sometimes, just sometimes, regular revenge paired with massive success is even better." Over the next 5 weeks, Margaret absorbed information like a sponge. She learned the difference between HMO and PPO contracts, understood diagnosis codes and reimbursement rates. She discovered she had a gift for seeing inefficiencies in systems, probably from years of managing a household on Richard's deliberately restricted budget. She also learned about herself. Without Richard's constant criticism, she stood taller. Without his controlling presence, she made decisions quickly and confidently. Without his narcissistic abuse disguised as concern, she remembered who she had been before she became Mrs. Richard Sullivan. "You're a natural," Robert told her one evening as they reviewed acquisition paperwork. "Your instincts are excellent." "It's not instinct," Margaret corrected. "It's 20 years of watching Richard make these same moves. I was his unpaid intern for 2 decades. I just didn't realize I was taking notes." Emma grew stronger each day, finally able to breathe without assistance. Margaret would hold her daughter while reviewing contracts, whispering her plans for their future. "Your daddy thinks we're worthless," she would say, "but your great-grandmother knew better. She knew that women like us don't break. We rebuild, and then we buy the building." 3 weeks into her education, Margaret made her first major decision without consulting anyone. She hired 20 new female doctors for the chain's emergency departments, specifically recruiting those who had published papers on gender bias in medical treatment. "Expensive," Robert noted, but he was smiling. "Necessary," Margaret countered. "Every woman who walks into our hospitals will be heard, believed, and treated with dignity. That's not just good medicine. It's good business." Eleanor watched from the doorway, some pride evident on her face. "Patricia would be so proud. You're not just learning the business. You're revolutionizing it." As the 5th week began, Margaret stood in what would soon be her office, looking out at the London skyline. Tomorrow she would sign the papers making her the owner of MedLife International. In 1 week, Richard's contracts would come up for renewal. He still hadn't tried to contact her except through lawyers. His latest offer had increased to $75,000 a year, which his attorney called generous given the circumstances. Margaret had laughed when Victoria showed her the letter. $75,000 a year. She now made that in interest every 3 days. "Should we counter?" Victoria had asked. "No," Margaret had said. "Let him think I'm considering it. Let him think I'm the same desperate woman he left in that hospital room." Now, standing in her soon-to-be office, Margaret pulled out her phone and listened to Richard's voicemail again. Not for pain, but for motivation. "She managed one at the last minute," his recorded voice said. "Probably thought it would save the marriage." Margaret deleted the voicemail. She didn't need it anymore. Tomorrow, she would become CEO of MedLife International. Next week, she would have her first board meeting. And sometime after that, Richard Sullivan would learn that abandoning his wife during childbirth had been the worst business decision of his life. The Phoenix Fund had risen from the ashes. Now it was time to soar. 6 weeks after Paris, Margaret stood in her new office in London, watching the city wake up through floor-to-ceiling windows. The transformation was complete, at least on paper. She was now CEO of MedLife International, owner of 12 hospitals, employer of 15,000 people. But more importantly, she was no longer Richard Sullivan's victim. Emma slept peacefully in a bassinet beside her desk, a sight that would have horrified Richard. He had always insisted that children had no place in professional settings. Margaret had made it policy that all MedLife facilities would have on-site childcare for employees. "Mrs. Sullivan, your 9 o'clock is here," her assistant announced. Margaret had kept the Sullivan name professionally for now. It would make the revelation that much sweeter. Dr. Sarah Chen entered with 3 other department heads. Over the past weeks, Margaret had assembled a team of brilliant women and men who understood her vision. "The staff is ready for your vision presentation this afternoon," Sarah said. "They're curious about the new ownership." Margaret nodded. "Every woman who walks through our doors will be heard, believed, and treated with dignity. Every employee will have access to childcare, mental health support, and advancement opportunities based on merit, not politics." Robert James entered without knocking a privilege Margaret had granted her CFO. His expression was serious. "We have a situation," he said. "Richard's companies have submitted their contract renewal proposals. They're demanding a 15% discount based on volume." Margaret actually laughed. "They want a discount after what their CEO did to the new owner." "They don't know you're the owner," Robert reminded her. "The acquisition was done through shell companies. As far as they know, Eleanor sold to an anonymous investment group." "Perfect," Margaret said. "Counter with a 30% increase." Robert's eyes widened. "That's aggressive." "That's business," Margaret corrected. They can pay it or find other facilities. Oh, and add a clause about family leave. Any company contracting with us must provide 6 months paid parental leave. Sarah whistled low. That'll cause waves. Good, or it's time someone made waves in this industry. As her team dispersed to implement her decisions, Margaret turned back to the window. Somewhere in New York, Richard was probably reviewing the contract proposals, irritated by the increase but not yet alarmed. He had no idea who he was really negotiating with. Her phone buzzed. Victoria calling from New York. Margaret, I've been monitoring the situation. Richard's having financial troubles. His investors are getting nervous about the contract renewals. How nervous? Morrison Ashley's father is threatening to pull funding if the medical contracts aren't secured. He doesn't know about Richard and his daughter yet. Margaret felt a flutter of anticipation. Keep monitoring. Don't interfere. Let Richard hang himself with his own rope. That afternoon, Margaret addressed 500 MedLife employees via video conference. She kept her face in shadow, her voice digitally altered slightly enough to maintain anonymity, but not enough to sound artificial. Healthcare is about trust, she said. Patients trust us with their lives, their fears, their most vulnerable moments. For too long, that trust has been betrayed by a system that prioritizes profit over people. That changes now. She outlined her vision: patient-centered care, employee support, innovation in treatment. She announced the new policies: no woman's pain would be dismissed as anxiety, no mother's concerns would be ignored, no patient would be abandoned. Some of you may wonder why this matters to me, she continued. 6 weeks ago, I was a patient in one of our hospitals. I was abandoned during premature labor, left alone to face both childbirth and divorce. That experience taught me that healthcare isn't just about medicine, it's about humanity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emails flooded in from employees sharing their own stories, thanking her for understanding, pledging their commitment to the new vision. Eleanor called that evening. You've inspired them. The entire chain is buzzing with excitement. It's just the beginning, Margaret said, feeding Emma her bottle. Next week, when Richard realizes who owns these hospitals, the real work begins. Are you ready for that confrontation? Margaret thought about the woman she had been 6 weeks ago, scared, alone, dependent. That woman was gone, replaced by someone Richard wouldn't recognize. I've been ready for 20 years, and she said, I just didn't know it. 3 days later, Robert burst into her office with his laptop. You need to see this. He pulled up a business news site. The headline read, Sullivan Industries hemorrhaging value as medical contracts stall. Already, Margaret asked. It gets better. Listen to this quote from Richard. Robert read from the screen. These delays are minor negotiations with a new, obviously inexperienced ownership group. We expect resolution within days. Inexperienced, Margaret repeated and smiling. Perfect. Let him keep thinking that. Her phone rang. Eleanor. My dear, I just received a very interesting call. Richard Sullivan himself wants to meet with the new owner of MedLife. He's flying to London tomorrow. Margaret's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. Tell him the owner will meet him at the Global Healthcare Summit in Geneva. 3 days from now, public setting, lots of witnesses. You're going to reveal yourself at the summit. I'm going to do more than that, Margaret said. I'm going to give a keynote about our new direction. And Richard's going to be in the audience when he realizes his ex-wife owns his lifeline. She looked at Emma, who was grasping at a toy with determined concentration. Your daddy's about to learn that underestimating women is bad for business. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret worked with a speech coach to eliminate 20 years of apologetic uptalk that Richard had trained into her. She had her hair styled, bought a wardrobe that projected power rather than ornament. She practiced walking into rooms like she owned them, because now she did. The morning of the summit, she stood in her Geneva hotel room, looking at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was unrecognizable from the abandoned wife in the Paris hospital. This woman stood tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, eyes clear and confident. You are Patricia Hartley's granddaughter, she told her reflection. You are Eleanor Whitmore's protege. You are Emma's mother. And you are about to destroy the man who thought you were worthless. Sophie, who Margaret had flown in to help with Emma, appeared in the doorway. Madame, you look formidable. Thank you, Sophie. Is Emma settled? Sleeping peacefully. She will be perfect when you bring her on stage. Margaret's eyes widened. I'm not bringing her on stage. Sophie smiled mysteriously. Eleanor suggested otherwise. She said to trust the drama of the moment. An hour later, Margaret stood backstage at the Geneva Convention Center, listening to the conference organizer introduce her. In the audience, she could see Richard in the third row, checking his phone, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the new CEO of MedLife International, Margaret Sullivan. She walked onto the stage, each step measured and confident. The auditorium was dim enough that Richard didn't look up immediately. But when she spoke, when her voice rang out clear and strong, his head snapped up so fast she could hear it from the stage. 6 months ago, she began, I gave birth alone in a Paris hospital while my husband of 20 years filed for divorce. The audience murmured. Richard's face had gone white. Today, she continued, I own that hospital and 11 others. The murmur became a roar. Margaret stood at the podium, letting the noise wash over her. She caught Richard's eye and held it, watching 20 years of condescension crumble into shock. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. And for once, Richard Sullivan had no words. 6 months ago, she continued, her voice carrying over the gradually quieting audience, I learned that 43-year-old women are disposable, that 20-year marriages mean nothing, that narcissistic abuse can wear a designer suit and speak in boardroom language. She clicked to her first slide, a photo of Saint-Antoine Hospital in Paris. This is where I was abandoned during premature labor. This is also the first hospital in what is now the MedLife International chain. Today, it has a new wing dedicated to high-risk pregnancies, staffed entirely by doctors who specialize in cases dismissed by other facilities. The audience was riveted. Richard looked like he might bolt, but his ego kept him seated. He couldn't leave without making a scene, and Richard Sullivan never made scenes, he created them for others. The medical industry, Margaret continued, has a gender problem. Women's pain is dismissed 23% more often than men's. Women wait 65% longer for pain medication in emergency rooms. Women with heart disease are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed. She clicked through slides showing statistics, each one a damning indictment of the system Richard's companies profited from. At MedLife International, we're changing that. Every facility now has protocols specifically designed to address gender bias in treatment. Every emergency room is staffed with doctors trained to recognize how diseases present differently in women. Every patient who tells us something is wrong will be believed. A hand shot up from the audience. Mrs. Sullivan, how does a former housewife suddenly have the capital and knowledge to run a medical empire? Margaret smiled. The question was planted, Victoria had made sure of it. An excellent question. It turns out that 20 years of being married to a hostile takeover specialist is quite an education. I spent 2 decades as an unpaid intern, watching my millionaire ex-husband build his empire. I learned about leveraged buyouts at dinner parties. I absorbed negotiation tactics during phone calls he thought I wasn't smart enough to understand. She paused, letting the words sink in. As for capital, I had help. My grandmother, Patricia Hartley, left me not just an inheritance, but a legacy. And Eleanor Whitmore, the brilliant woman who built this medical chain, chose to sell it to someone who understood that healthcare is about more than profit margins. This is ridiculous, Richard's voice cut through the room. He was standing now, his face red with rage. You know nothing about running hospitals. Margaret had hoped he would crack. She turned to face him directly, microphone in hand. Richard, so glad you could make it. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Sullivan, CEO of Sullivan Industries. Also the man who abandoned his wife during premature labor to commit adultery with a 23-year-old. Gasps rippled through the audience. Phones appeared, recording everything. How dare you? Richard started. How dare I what? Margaret interrupted, her voice steel. Tell the truth, run a business, succeed without you. A young woman's voice piped up from the back. Richard, who is this? Everyone turned. Ashley Morrison stood in the doorway, designer dress, confused expression, clearly having followed Richard to Geneva. I'm the CEO of MedLife International, Margaret said calmly. And you are, I'm, I'm Richard's, Ashley faltered, looking at Richard for help. But Richard was looking at someone else, a distinguished older man who had just entered behind Ashley. Morrison, Ashley's father, his biggest investor. Daddy, Ashley said, confused. What are you doing here? Morrison's face was granite. I could ask you the same question. Ashley, Margaret watched the disaster unfold with clinical detachment. This was better than anything she could have orchestrated. Richard's narcissistic need to have his young girlfriend follow him had just cost him everything. Perhaps we should return to the presentation, Margaret suggested smoothly. Mr. Sullivan, you were concerned about my qualifications? Richard sank back into his chair, defeated. Margaret clicked to her next slide. MedLife International's new contracts include mandatory 6-month parental leave for all employees of contracting companies. Any company that doesn't meet this standard will find other medical facilities for their needs. That's blackmail, Richard sputtered. That's business, Margaret corrected. The same kind of business you've conducted for 20 years, except my version doesn't abandon pregnant women or destroy families for profit. She clicked to the final slide, a photo of Emma. This is my daughter. She was born at 28 weeks, weighing 3 pounds. Her father signed away his parental rights before she was even released from the NICU. But she survived, thrived, and taught me that the strongest things often come in the smallest packages. Sophie appeared at the side of the stage, carrying Emma. Without hesitation, Margaret walked over and took her daughter, returning to the podium with Emma in her arms. Ladies and gentlemen, the future of healthcare isn't just about medicine. It's about humanity. It's about women supporting women. It's about recognizing that financial independence after 50 isn't just possible. It's powerful. It's about understanding that a midlife transformation journey can begin in the worst moment of your life and lead to this stage. The applause was thunderous. Margaret stood there, holding Emma, watching Richard shrink in his seat as Morrison's glare burned holes in his back. One more thing, Margaret said as the applause died down. Effective immediately, MedLife is terminating all contracts with companies that don't meet our new standards. Mr. Sullivan, your companies have 72 hours to comply or find new facilities. Richard stood abruptly and stormed out, Ashley hurrying after him, Morrison following with the expression that promised retribution. The audience erupted in discussion, but Margaret was done. She walked off stage to Eleanor's waiting embrace. Patricia would be so proud, Eleanor whispered. We're not done yet, Margaret whispered back. This was just the opening salvo. Victoria appeared, phone in hand. Morrison just called. He's pulling all funding from Sullivan Industries effective immediately. He also wants to discuss investing in MedLife. Margaret smiled. Tell him we'll meet next week, after Richard's companies finish crashing. You know he'll try to destroy you now, Eleanor warned. Wounded narcissists are dangerous. Let him try, Margaret said, kissing Emma's head. I've got $200 million, 12 hospitals, and the best team in the business. He's got a crumbling empire and a reputation in ruins. Robert appeared with his tablet. Stock price for Sullivan Industries just dropped 30%. Trading has been halted. Margaret felt no joy in Richard's destruction, only a sense of justice. He had abandoned her at her most vulnerable. Now she was returning the favor, but with significantly better style. What's next? Sarah Chen asked, joining their group. Now we build, Margaret said. We create the healthcare system women deserve. We prove that companies can be profitable and compassionate. We show the world that women supporting women isn't just a hashtag, it's a revolution. She looked down at Emma, who was gazing up at her with those eyes so like her father's, but holding none of his cruelty. And we ensure that no woman is ever abandoned in a hospital room again. 1 year after Paris, Margaret sat in a New York courtroom, the same courthouse where Richard had once triumphantly concluded hostile takeovers. Now, he sat across from her, diminished, his empire in ruins, fighting over scraps in their divorce proceedings. Judge Martha Coleman presiding, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach and particular intolerance for men who abandon pregnant wives. Victoria had been strategic in ensuring they drew her for the case. We're here for the Sullivan divorce proceedings, Judge Coleman announced, reviewing the papers. Mr. Sullivan, I see you're contesting the original settlement you proposed. Richard's new attorney, he'd gone through 3 since Morrison pulled funding, stood nervously. Your Honor, my client's circumstances have changed dramatically. Mrs. Sullivan's inheritance and business acquisitions should be considered marital assets. Margaret watched Richard's face, seeing the desperation he was trying to hide. Sullivan Industries had declared bankruptcy 3 months ago. His assets were frozen. The apartment he'd shared with Ashley was in foreclosure. Ashley herself had disappeared back to Switzerland after her father cut her off. Victoria stood, immaculate as always. Your Honor, we have several points to address. First, Mr. Sullivan abandoned his wife during premature labor to commit adultery. Allegedly, Richard's attorney interjected. Victoria smiled. We have security footage from the Paris hospital. She handed a USB drive to the bailiff. Additionally, we have a voicemail Mr. Sullivan left his wife while with his mistress. The courtroom watched as the security footage played Richard walking out of the hospital room while Margaret was clearly in distress. Then the voicemail, Richard's dismissive tone, Ashley's giggle, the damning words about Margaret being barren. Judge Coleman's expression grew increasingly disgusted. Mr. Sullivan, is this your voice? Richard's jaw clenched. Yes, but, and is this you leaving your wife in premature labor? I had a business meeting. That's a yes, the judge noted. Continue, Ms. Barnes. Victoria pulled out more documents. The prenuptial agreement, Mr. Sullivan insisted upon specifically states that inheritance received during the marriage remains separate property. Mrs. Sullivan's grandmother's trust was released after the separation, making it entirely hers. But she used that money to destroy my business, Richard burst out. Margaret finally spoke. I used that money to buy hospitals. Richard, what happened to your business was a result of your own choices. Judge Coleman raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Sullivan, would you care to elaborate? Margaret stood, Emma on her hip. She'd brought her daughter deliberately, knowing the visual impact. Your Honor, I purchased a medical chain that Mr. Sullivan's companies happened to contract with. I required all contracting companies to provide parental leave and meet certain ethical standards. His companies failed to meet those standards. The free market responded accordingly. You targeted me, Richard accused. The way you targeted me when you sent me alone to Paris? Margaret responded calmly. When you changed our account passwords while I was in labor, when you had divorce papers served while I was recovering from an emergency C-section, the judge held up her hand. I've heard enough. Mr. Sullivan, you abandoned your wife during a medical emergency. You attempted to financially strand her in a foreign country. You committed adultery, and now you want access to money she inherited after you left her. She shuffled papers with obvious disgust. Here's my ruling. The original settlement stands. Mrs. Sullivan gets the Connecticut house and $50,000 annually. Though given Mr. Sullivan's current financial state, that alimony is suspended until he's employed. Mrs. Sullivan's inheritance and business assets are entirely hers. Furthermore, she paused, looking directly at Richard. Mr. Sullivan, you signed away parental rights to avoid child support. That decision is final. You have no claim to Emma Sullivan, and she has no financial obligation to you. This is ridiculous. Richard stood, his facade finally cracking completely. I made her who she is. Margaret stood too, matching his energy but with calm control. No, Richard, you made me who I was. I made me who I am. You were nothing, he shouted. A failed artist playing housewife. Everything you have is because of what you learned from me. The courtroom was silent. Even his attorney looked embarrassed. Margaret smiled, a genuine smile. You're right. I did learn from you. I learned how to recognize a hostile takeover. I learned how to exploit weakness. I learned how to read contracts and find loopholes. 20 years of watching you destroy companies taught me exactly how to destroy yours. She adjusted Emma on her hip, her daughter playing with her pearl necklace, Patricia Hartley's pearls. But here's what you never learned. Richard, business isn't just about winning. It's about building something that matters. You spent 20 years destroying. I've spent 1 year creating. You abandoned your family for a stock price. I built an empire on the principle that no family should be abandoned. Judge Coleman gavelled. We're done here. Divorce granted. Mrs. Sullivan, you're free to resume your maiden name if you choose. I'll keep Sullivan, Margaret said, looking at Richard. I've earned it. As they left the courthouse, Richard caught up to them on the steps. Margaret, wait. She turned, Victoria moving protectively closer. Richard looked broken. Finally, as completely. I need your help. No one else will see me. My reputation is ruined. I have nothing. Margaret studied the man she'd once loved, then feared, then fought. Now she felt something unexpected pity. You have a daughter who deserves to know her father, even a flawed one, she said quietly. I signed away legal rights. Yes, but Emma will grow up knowing her father abandoned her. Unless you want to change that story. Richard's eyes filled with tears, genuine tears. Maybe the first she'd ever seen from him. None of us deserve grace. Richard, that's what makes it grace. Margaret shifted Emma to her other hip. I'm not offering you a job or money or restoration. But if you want to know your daughter, if you're willing to do the work to become someone worthy of her, we can discuss supervised visits. Richard nodded, unable to speak. Call Victoria when you're ready. And Richard, Margaret waited until he met her eyes. Therapy, real therapy, not the performance you did during our marriage counseling. Deal with your narcissistic behaviors. Learn to actually care about someone besides yourself. Emma deserves a father, but only if he's healthy enough not to hurt her. As their car pulled away, Victoria shook her head. That was more generous than he deserved. It wasn't for him, Margaret said, kissing Emma's head. It's for her. Every child deserves the chance to know both parents, even if one of them has to earn that privilege. She looked back at the courthouse where Richard still stood, looking lost. Besides, she added, the best revenge isn't destroying someone completely. It's succeeding so thoroughly that you can afford to be gracious. My grandmother taught me that, in her own way. Her phone buzzed. Eleanor calling. Turn on the news, Eleanor said without preamble. Margaret had the driver turn on the radio. MedLife International announced today that it's expanding to the United States with the acquisition of 3 major hospital chains. CEO Margaret Sullivan, who took over the European chain just 1 year ago, has transformed it into the fastest-growing healthcare company in the world. The acquisition makes MedLife the 3rd largest medical provider globally. Margaret smiled. Did you know about this? I may have facilitated some introductions, Eleanor said coyly. Your grandmother had contacts everywhere. They've been waiting to see what Patricia Hartley's granddaughter would do with her inheritance. And they're impressed. The offer came from them, not us. They want to be part of what you're building. Margaret looked at Emma, who had fallen asleep in her arms. 1 year ago, she'd been abandoned, alone, afraid. Now she was building a healthcare revolution. You know what this means? Eleanor continued. You'll be running hospitals in the same cities where Richard once did business, where he once had power. The universe has a sense of humor, Margaret agreed, but she wasn't thinking about Richard anymore. She was thinking about the thousands of women who would walk into MedLife hospitals, women in labor, women in pain, women afraid and alone, and find not abandonment but support, not dismissal but validation. She was thinking about her grandmother, who had somehow seen this future and planned for it. About Eleanor, who had recognized a phoenix ready to rise. About Sophie, Sarah, Robert, Victoria, the team that had believed in her before she believed in herself. Mostly, she was thinking about Emma, who would grow up in a world where her mother had proven that 43-year-old women weren't disposable, that 20-year marriages ending could be beginnings, that millionaire ex-husbands who thought their wives were worthless could be wrong, that women supporting women wasn't just a phrase, it was a power that could change the world. 2 years after that night in Paris, Margaret stood in the same hospital room where her life had shattered and reformed. The space had been renovated, part of MedLife's new birthing center, but she could still map every memory onto these walls. The corner where Richard had stood checking his phone, the spot where she'd gripped the bed rails, the door he'd walked through, never looking back. Emma toddled beside her, nearly 2 now, dark curls bouncing as she explored the room with fearless curiosity. "Mama up!" Emma demanded, raising her arms. Margaret lifted her daughter, settling her on her hip with practiced ease. Through the window, Paris spread before them, afternoon sun turning the Seine to gold. "This is where you were born, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, "where everything changed." "Madame Sullivan." Sophie's voice rang out from the doorway. The young nurse who had held Margaret's hand through labor was now head of maternity services, recruited personally by Margaret to transform the birthing experience at Saint-Antoine. "Sophie," Margaret embraced her warmly. "How is our new patient?" "Scared," Sophie said quietly. "Her husband just left. Said he couldn't handle the stress of a premature birth." Margaret's jaw tightened. Some things never changed, but now she could do something about it. "What's her name?" or Claire Dubois. 28 weeks pregnant. Early labor. Husband filed for divorce yesterday. Margaret handed Emma to Sophie. "Watch her for a moment." She walked down the hall to room 247, knocking gently before entering. The woman in the bed looked up with red-rimmed eyes. So young, so frightened, so familiar. "Mrs. Dubois, I'm Margaret Sullivan. I own this hospital." Claire's eyes widened. "The CEO, why are you—" "Because 2 years ago, I was you." Margaret pulled a chair close to the bed. 28 weeks pregnant, early labor, husband walking out. "Only I didn't have what you're going to have." "What's that?" Claire whispered. "Support, resources, options." Margaret took the young woman's hand. "Your medical care is covered completely. We have a fund for situations exactly like this. You'll have a private room, the best doctors, and when you're ready, our legal team will ensure you get everything you're entitled to in the divorce." Claire started crying. "Why would you do this?" "Because women supporting women isn't just a corporate slogan here. It's what we do." Margaret squeezed her hand. "You're not alone. You'll never be alone here." She stayed with Claire until the young woman was calm, then returned to find Eleanor in her office. Emma playing with blocks on the floor while Sophie and Eleanor discussed staffing reports. "How many is that now?" Eleanor asked. 15 women this month across all facilities," Margaret replied. 15 women abandoned during pregnancy or childbirth, and all 15 receiving full support from the Patricia Hartley Foundation. Margaret nodded. The foundation, funded by her inheritance returns, provided everything from medical care to legal services to housing assistance for women abandoned during their most vulnerable moments. Eleanor's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled. "Speaking of your grandmother's legacy, you'll want to see this." She handed Margaret the phone. A news alert. Richard Sullivan, named director of Morrison Foundation's New Men's Mental Health Initiative. Margaret read further. Richard had spent the past year in intensive therapy, publicly discussing his journey to address narcissistic personality disorder. Morrison, of all people, had funded his transformation, saying that men who destroyed their families needed treatment, not just punishment. "He's doing the work," Eleanor observed. "Finally," Margaret agreed. She'd allowed supervised visits with Emma 6 months ago. Richard was awkward, uncertain, but trying. Emma called him Richard instead of Daddy, which seemed appropriate. Victoria entered without knocking another person who'd earned that privilege. "We have a situation. Wall Street Journal wants to do a profile. From abandoned wife to medical mogul, the Margaret Sullivan story." Margaret considered. She'd avoided most media, preferring to let the work speak for itself. But, "Tell them yes, but I want to bring someone with me." "Who won?" "Claire Dubois. Let her tell her story alongside mine. Show that this isn't just history, it's happening every day." Robert appeared in the doorway, grinning. "Speaking of media attention, we just got word. Fortune 500. MedLife made the list." The room erupted in celebration. Margaret picked up Emma, spinning her around as her daughter giggled. Fortune 500. From abandoned wife to running one of the most successful companies in America in 2 years. Her phone rang. "Richard." "I'll take this outside," she said, stepping onto the terrace. "Margaret." Richard's voice was different now. Therapy had stripped away the arrogance, leaving something raw but more honest. "I saw the news, Fortune 500, congratulations." "Thank you. I wanted to tell you, in therapy today, we talked about making amends. Real amends, not the performative kind." Margaret waited. "I was wrong. About everything. You weren't worthless. You were priceless. And I was too narcissistic to see it. Emma isn't a mistake or a burden. She's extraordinary. The divorce wasn't your failure. It was mine. Richard, please let me finish. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know what I did is unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it. The cruelty, the calculation, the narcissistic abuse disguised as love. And I'm sorry. Genuinely. Truly sorry. Margaret looked through the window at Emma, who was now building an impressively tall tower with blocks. I appreciate that, Richard, and I hope you continue the work. For Emma's sake, if nothing else. I will. I promise. And Margaret, what you've built, it's remarkable. You've helped thousands of women. You've changed an entire industry. You did all that despite me, but maybe also because of me. Because surviving me made you strong enough to do this. Margaret thought about it. No, Richard. Surviving you didn't make me strong. It revealed strength that was always there. Strength my grandmother saw. Strength Eleanor recognized. Strength that Emma will inherit. You didn't make me who I am. You just got out of the way long enough for me to become myself. After ending the call, Margaret returned to her office to find her team planning the Fortune 500 celebration. Champagne. Eleanor offered. Orange juice. Margaret countered. Some of our employees are pregnant. Everyone laughed. Classic Margaret, always thinking of others. As the sun set over Paris, Margaret stood at the window with Emma in her arms, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and built. Eleanor, her mentor and friend. Sophie, who'd held her hand through the worst night of her life. Victoria, Robert, Sarah, the team that had helped her build an empire from ashes. You know what I realize, Margaret said to the room. Everyone talks about the phoenix rising from the ashes, but no one talks about what the phoenix does after it rises. What does it do? Sophie asked. Margaret smiled, looking at each face in turn. It builds a nest. It creates a home for other birds who've been burned. It teaches them to fly. And eventually, it creates a whole flock of phoenixes, all risen, all powerful, all supporting each other. Emma pointed at a bird flying past the window and said her new favorite word, fly. That's right, baby, Margaret whispered. We fly. Eleanor raised her juice glass. To Patricia Hartley, who saw the future and planned for it. To abandoned wives who became CEOs. To narcissistic ex-husbands who accidentally created their own competition. To midlife transformations that begin in hospital rooms. And to women supporting women, not just in word but in deed. Not just in gesture, but in empire building. Revolutionary, world-changing action. They toasted as the Eiffel Tower began its evening sparkle, and Margaret thought about the journey. 2 years ago, she'd been left with nothing but pain and $10,000. Now she ran a healthcare empire worth billions. 2 years ago, she'd been told she was worthless. Now she employed thousands and had transformed healthcare for millions. But the real transformation wasn't in the money or the power. It was in the knowledge that she'd always been valuable, had always been capable, had always been enough. Richard leaving hadn't broken her. It had freed her. 5 years had passed since that night in Paris. Margaret stood before 3,000 healthcare executives at the Global Medical Innovation Summit in New York, the same city where Richard had once ruled his empire. But this wasn't about Richard anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned every word. 5 years ago, MedLife International was 12 hospitals in Europe. Today, we're the largest healthcare network in the world, operating in 32 countries. But our measure of success isn't in numbers. It's in lives changed. The screen behind her showed statistics. Maternal mortality down 40% in MedLife facilities. Gender bias in diagnosis reduced by 60%. Employee satisfaction at an all-time high across the industry. We did this by following one simple principle: believing women, believing patients, believing that healthcare is a human right, not a luxury. In the front row sat her board of directors. Eleanor, now chairman emeritus, silver hair gleaming under the lights. Victoria, chief legal officer, who'd turned down Supreme Court clerkships to stay with MedLife. Robert, whose financial wizardry had made them the most profitable healthcare company while maintaining the lowest patient costs. Sarah Chen, chief medical officer, who'd revolutionized their treatment protocols. And in the third row, surprisingly, sat Richard. Not the Richard of 5 years ago. That man was gone. This Richard was grayed, humbled, taking notes as she spoke. He ran a foundation now, teaching reformed narcissistic executives how to recognize and address their toxic behaviors. He saw Emma every other weekend, had learned to braid her hair, attended her ballet recitals, and never once complained about the glitter that inevitably covered his designer suits afterward.